Well, hello, everyone. We saw some people coming in here. We're right at the top of the hour. Thanks, everyone, for joining us this evening for this talk between Juneteenth and the 4th of July, a conversation about Christian nationalism. I'm going to be joined tonight. I'm Robert Jones. I'm the CEO and founder of PRRI, co-sponsor of the event tonight. I'm going to be joined by Kristin and Amanda Tyler of BJC, who is also co-sponsor of the event tonight. I'm going to hand things over to Amanda in just a minute, but before I do so, I'm going to tell you a little bit about her. So Amanda Tyler, she's the executive director of BJC. It's an organization I have long admired. I grew up as a Southern Baptist, and the work that they have done kind of upholding the historic Baptist principle of religious liberty, something I've always looked to and appreciated. They defend the free exercise of religion and protecting its establishment by government. Amanda is a sought-after speaker in a range of places, churches, educational institutions, denominations, and often provides commentary on church-state issues to the media. So we are in really good hands with her tonight. And then one other thing, or two other things, I should say, that are relevant to our conversation is that she is a native of Texas. We're going to be talking about Juneteenth tonight. She's a member of the Texas and the U.S. Supreme Court Bar. And one other thing is she was named Baptist of the Year by ethicsdaily.com in 2019 for her work leading the Christians Against Christian Nationalism campaign, which is right on point for our conversation tonight. So with that, let me turn it over to you, Amanda.
Well, thanks so much, Robbie, and thank you for the invitation to co-host with you here tonight and to moderate this conversation. So I'm going to begin by introducing our esteemed speakers. First, Kristin Kobus-Dumais is Professor of History and Gender Studies at Calvin University. She holds a PhD from the University of Notre Dame, and her research focuses on the intersection of gender, religion, and politics. Kristin has written for the New York Times, the Washington Post, NBC News, Religion News Service, and Christianity Today, and has been interviewed on NPR, CBS, the BBC, among other outlets. Her recent book is the New York Times bestseller, Jesus and John Wayne, How White Evangelicals Corrupted a Faith and Fractured a Nation. So we're so lucky to have you here with us tonight, Kristin. And Robert P. Jones, our host for the evening, is the CEO and founder of PRRI and a leading scholar and commentator on religion, culture, and politics. He's the author of White Too Long, The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity, as well as The End of White Christian America, which won the 2019 Grauemeyer Award in Religion. The paperback edition of White Too Long, which contains a new afterword reflecting on the 2020 election and the January 6th insurrection, is now available for pre-order, and it will ship on July 13th, just a little more than a week from today. Jones writes regularly on politics, culture, and religion for The Atlantic Online, NBC Think, and other outlets. He holds a PhD in religion from Emory University, an MDiv from Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, and a Bachelor of Science in Computing Science and Mathematics from Mississippi College. Jones was selected by Emory University's Graduate Division of Religion as Distinguished Alumnus of the Year in 2013, and by Mississippi College's Mathematics Department as Alumnus of the Year in 2016. So welcome, Robbie, as well. So we're we very intentionally situated our conversation here tonight between two federal holidays celebrating freedom and independence, Juneteenth and Independence Day, which we commonly call, of course, July 4th. Independence Day has been celebrated on July 4th since 1777 and became a federal holiday in 1870. Juneteenth has been celebrated on June 19th since 1865, first in Galveston, Texas, then across Texas, and now across the nation. And just 2 weeks ago, it was recognized as a federal holiday, and it's now officially known as Juneteenth National Independence Day. So there's a lot, I think, in reflecting on this theme that Juneteenth and July 4th have in common. They're both celebrations of independence and freedom. They both mark historical events, but have also become bound up in modern conceptions of American identity. And so, to start off with, I wanted to invite you both to reflect on the importance of these holidays, how they've been celebrated historically. That's why I kind of gave a little bit of this history here, and up until the present day. And also, as you comment, something that we talked about previously is this concept of historical memory and how that has been politicized, and in particular around these holidays. So, Robbie, I'm going to invite you to start us off in this conversation tonight.
Great. Well, thanks for setting the table so beautifully. I think that it is right. I mean, I think it's a really auspicious time for us to be having this conversation. The first time we've got these two federal holidays sitting really in quite close juxtaposition to one another. And I think there's something quite fitting, even though it's kind of an accident of history that they're falling where they fall. It is nice that they're sitting right together. I went just this week and looked at, for example, the National Museum of African American History and Culture and their site on Juneteenth. And they called it the country's second Independence Day, and I think that is how it has been celebrated by African Americans, since its inception going forward. But as they noted, and said they haven't quite updated their text yet, but I think it's helpful that they haven't. They said, although it has been celebrated in the African American community, this monumental event remains largely unknown to most Americans, and I think that's largely true. It's something I've known about, but I think the only reason that I've known about it even growing up is that my birthday is June 19th. And I grew up, my early years before the age of 7 were in Texas. And so I saw these celebrations, in the African American community, but they were clearly not celebrated in the white community that I was a part of, right? It was something that I just observed happening around me, and even had to ask what's going on, right, with these celebrations. And so, but the other thing I wanted to do is to kind of hold a moment to kind of hold out that, this second Independence Day, to kind of point to how fraught I think the 4th of July, right, has been for African Americans, and give Frederick Douglass a little space here. And the one thing I actually only recently learned was that it was so fraught that many African Americans, instead of celebrating on July 4th, celebrated on July 5th, right? Just to kind of give it some space and to make the point about the contradictions between the principles that are there in the Declaration of Independence, right? That all men are created equal with unalienable rights that come from God, and the realities that they experience. I'm going to just a quick little reading here from Frederick Douglass's speech. What to the slave is your 4th of July? He begins with this, and again, he was actually invited to give this speech by a white women's organization on the 4th of July, and he actually postponed it to the 5th exactly to make this point. And he says this: I answer a day that reveals to him more than all other days in the year the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim. To him, your celebration is a sham, your boasted liberty an unholy license, your national greatness swelling vanity, your sounds of rejoicing are empty and heartless, your denunciation of tyrants brass-fronted impudence, your shouts of liberty and equality hollow mockery, your prayers and hymns, your sermons and thanksgivings, with all your religious parade and solemnity, are to him mere bombast, fraud, deception, impiety, and hypocrisy, a thin veil to cover up crimes which would disgrace a nation of savages. There's not a nation on the earth guilty of practices more shocking and bloody than are the people of the United States at this very hour. And then he says, this 4th of July is yours, not mine. You may rejoice, but I must mourn. So that was in 1852. But I think it's kind of worth kind of just taking that in for a moment, right? And then here we sit in 2021, now between these two holidays, a kind of first independence and a second independence that we can actually hold up on more equal footing.
Yeah, I would say, so I'm not from Texas, I'm from Iowa. And I only in recent years started hearing about Juneteenth. And at first, I was a little bit curious. And then even as recently as 2 or 3 years ago, I was really under the impression that this was not my holiday to celebrate, right? That there was some kind of a appropriation maybe that would take place. And so respecting others' celebrations, but I'm not feeling that really that this was meant for me necessarily. And so I think that it really is an important moment now that this has become a federal holiday, and it's clear that this is for the country in different ways. I think for white Americans to mark the day, and it means something different, I think, for African Americans as well. But when I was listening to an interview by Annette Gordon-Reed this last week, I think it was, so she has this new book out on Juneteenth, and she said something that stuck with me, that it's Juneteenth is a holiday tailor-made for history. And this is where I think for white Americans like myself, especially not from Texas, to take this as an opportunity to learn the stories, to hear the stories that have not been our stories, and to celebrate and to learn traditions and that have not been our own. And I think that's one of the things that you mentioned, historical memory here. And as a historian, it's so clear to me that we do not, particularly around issues of race and identity, we do not have a common historical memory, right? And so when I teach my undergraduate students American history, and when I teach about race and inequality, and I'm assigning readings and confronting them with different stories, I know that my African American students are in some cases very familiar with the history of police brutality, a history of sexual violence, racialized sexual violence, because these are stories that are told in their families and stories that are passed down. And they know histories of inequality and housing discrimination and things like that. Whereas for my white students, the vast majority completely oblivious to these histories. And so we don't have a common historical memory in this country. And I think that the holiday and commemorating Juneteenth, with all that entails, can help us come to a closer understanding and have a common not entirely common, but at least be able to have a conversation across some of these differences. I'll say also, in terms of historical memory, the first Independence Day and the second Independence Day, it brings to mind also conflict and controversy around the 1619 Project. And then under the Trump administration, the proposed 1776 Commission, two very different ways of kind of celebrating and commemorating American history. And I think that those are reflected in some ways in the way that many white Americans, particularly conservative white Americans, want to celebrate Independence Day and celebrate, kind of a more glorious version of America's past, contrasted to what Juneteenth calls us to remember. And that corresponds to the 1619 Project, which is not just a story of darkness and oppression, but as Frederick Douglass's speech points to us, and as the 1619 Project makes clear, it really is holding up America's ideals, right? And how far short we have come, but as a way to inspire that we live into our ideals of liberty and justice for all.
Mm-hmm. I think it's really beautifully put, and I am thinking, I was jotting down the idea of appropriation, and how, and your reflections, Kristin, about it. Is this my holiday to celebrate? And I think I have had similar feelings, especially growing up in Texas, that it was. But I think we can celebrate, just like as you said, by acknowledging the history and taking it a moment to learn about the history as white Americans, right? I mean, obviously our panel tonight is speaking from the perspective of white Americans. And so it's the way that we can celebrate the holiday might look different. And when you talked about not having a common historical memory, I think, you know, this is part of our identity as Americans, to own this past, to understand and learn the past and own it as our American past. Something about Juneteenth that always struck me was, it, to me, it is in some ways a tragic holiday because it notes when the enslaved population in Texas learned about the Emancipation Proclamation, which was years after, right? The signing
Yeah,
of the
2 years
Emancipation.
later. Yeah.
Right, right. And yet it is celebrated as a joyous moment of independence. And so I think that that is also, to your word about the 1619 Project, a way that we're celebrating a resilience, we're celebrating a sense of victory over enslavement and all of that, and that we as white Americans can learn a lot about resilience and independence and freedom from marking that holiday and learning about it.
Amanda, like one just quick comment,
Sure.
you're making me think about is, one of the things that Douglas was trying to do and others by putting out their celebration on the 5th rather than the 4th, I think was to hold this space, right? To hold this gap here. And one of the things, I think the kind of beautiful things that Juneteenth becoming a federal holiday is that it permanently fixes this space between these two holidays, right? And you can almost think about them as a mirror, right? And I think particularly for white Christians, and this conversation tonight is really about, and we are all white Christians, and it's about challenges within that community. How would it, I mean, I think it's a really interesting question and a productive one to think about how our celebrations, white Christian celebrations of July 4th would change if we saw it reflected through Juneteenth and back to the 4th of July, right? How that dialectic would really, I think, help, better for like heal our really kind of distorted understandings of the 4th of July in many ways, and make them more honest and help us, I think, mend the gap between that historical memory that Kristin, you were talking about, right? That's one white, one black, and help us kind of move to something that is a more honest and inclusive accounting of that history.
Absolutely. And, this is such a new federal holiday, so it'll be interesting to see in years to come. I mean, it was declared a federal holiday and the next day it was observed. And so in the future, it will be interesting to see how these are integrated. Well, turning a little bit to July 4th, the holiday that's to come. Of course, this year it's going to be on a Sunday. And, in our conversation here tonight about white Christian nationalism, I think it will be a temptation for some churches to really celebrate this Sunday as a patriotic Sunday, one where patriotic symbols, maybe nationalist symbols, take over the sanctuary for a day. And we certainly saw a precursor to this past weekend. First Baptist Dallas held their annual Freedom Sunday a week early. I think they were afraid some people might be going on vacation, so they had it early. And it had patriotic songs, singing of the national anthem, waving of flags, which they passed out to all of the congregants, a salute to all branches of the U.S. military, and even a small indoor fireworks show. So, this is on a grand scale, but I think that we have seen, examples of this in congregations, not just this year, but for many years. I know growing up in my progressive Baptist church in Austin, Texas, we had an annual God and Country dinner on a Wednesday night where we would do much of this, minus the fireworks. But much of these things would be done then as well. And so, these are really textbook examples of Christian nationalism, the merging of our identities as Americans and Christians, and a reminder that happens not just in our public spaces, but also in our religious spaces as well. And so I just wanted to open a conversation about, what makes these expressions of patriotism in our sanctuaries and our houses of worship, what makes these so enduring? What's going on here?
I mean, I think one of the things that I've noticed, observing this kind of culture of patriotism, Christian nationalism within white American Christianity is just how unchallenged this is in many circles and how unexamined it is. that it's just taken for granted. It's part of the air that many conservative white Christians breathe. This is just this is American Christianity, right? This is faithful American citizenship. This is just what you do. And so that there's an American flag and a Christian flag in the front of the sanctuary is just the way things are. That's what church looks like. And so it really is unexamined up until it's contested, right? And that's where I've talked with a number of pastors who have stories to tell about what happens when you say, you know what, we really don't need the American flag up in front of the sanctuary. In fact, it's not biblical, and so let's just move it. One pastor who had so much conflict with his worship committee over moving it, and they had this kind of Cold War going on for more than a year, where he would move it to the side or he would move it to the back closet, and then it would appear back on the stage. Then he'd move it to the edge. Then they'd move it closer to the center again. And so it's when this is challenged, right, that you can see just how deeply important these symbols are to many Christians, including many just members of these churches. But say also in terms of cultural evangelicalism, this God and country faith has so permeated conservative white evangelicalism. One of my favorite things to do as a scholar is to go to Hobby Lobby and to look at their displays, knickknacks, wall plaques, things that you can buy. And they often have rows upon rows of patriotic God and country decor. And, plaques that say, I stand for the flag and I kneel for the Lord. And, red, white, and blue with Bible verses, and, that God is protecting our country. And it just seems so, for those who are immersed in this world, so good and true. And then challenging that conflation of Christianity and the American nation very much, because they're so conflated, comes across as challenging Christianity itself. And so it is deeply important to so many American Christians, and you'll find just how important it is when you try to challenge it.
Yeah. Thinking of this question, I can't help but I think one thing we all had in common was growing up, in evangelical settings. Mine was Southern Baptist, and thinking back in Mississippi, like the images that come to mind when I think about this is I remember Vacation Bible School, right? And we would line up outside, and the beginning of Vacation Bible School was a processional where we're all kind of in rows, and there is the Christian flag and the American flag at the head of the processional, leading us all into the sanctuary, where we would do the opening assembly before breaking up into our age groups. And as you said, Kristin, like every Sunday on each side of the stage, right, where the pulpit was the American flag and the Christian flag, always flanking the pulpit every Sunday morning. So just absorbing that, every day, it was as prominent as the baptistry, sitting behind the pulpit, or the communion table. It was a fixed part of the furniture, right, of the ritualized furniture there. And on the 4th of July, we even had a military color guard come march those flags into the sanctuary before worship service. Like, that was not an unusual thing. And then, it also makes me think about Stanley Hauerwas, who, no liberal, and I'm not a huge fan of his theology, but I do think one of the profound things he said, like, if I could do sort of one thing, it would be to kind of convince pastors to take the American flag out of the sanctuary, right, to kind of make Christian churches more faithful to the gospel. So this is not a liberal, but actually a biblical argument, right? And one that's about, because I think what you said, Kristin, is right too. This thing about conflation is the key challenge, right? And so that makes for bad politics, but it also makes for pretty terrible theology.
Yes.
Right? Because when these things are just kind of locked together, and as you said, if you criticize one, you criticize the other. But what that means is that you've lost any critical distance between the two, right? You've lost the prophetic role of what churches, are really called to do, to speak truth to power, to be the prophetic voice, and that when the state goes off the rails, to be the voice there to say, hey, wait a minute, this is not the way to go. But if it's that wrapped together, one just pulls the other along with it without any, you really lose a place to stand to even see the distinction between the gospel and politics, which is a really dangerous place, both for democracy and for the church.
Exactly. So earlier today, I posted a thread on Twitter in a blog post I'd written a few years back that made some of those points, drawing on the book that was published in 1983, Search for Christian America. And it was written by evangelical scholars, George Marsden, Mark Knoll, and Nathan Hatch. So this classic work. And they are speaking as conservative white evangelicals to fellow evangelicals and making precisely the argument that this is unintentionally and paradoxically, this conflation of God and country is actually contributing to secularization because it leaves the church unable to critically examine the nation and to critically examine their own allegiances and its idolatry. And so it's this powerful religious critique of Christian nationalism. And for many Christian nationalists, right, or just Christians who have accepted this conflation, again, they perceive a criticism of Christian nationalism as a criticism of Christianity and this kind of secular onslaught that has to be defended against. And what we can see is some of the fiercest critics of Christian nationalism are actually Christians themselves, and often conservative Christians.
Yeah, and I mean, I certainly resonate with that comment about the secularization, that Christian nationalism just secularizes Christianity in many ways. And even watching a little bit of that Freedom Sunday video, it might as well have been a July 4th special on PBS or something, I mean, because of the patriotic songs and the singing of the military songs. And it wasn't until they went into Great is Our God, which again was more about, at that point, military greatness than about other kind of power. Would you even recognize that you were in a church service? And so I do think, and I think it's much of those drivers that really animated the work that we've been leading at BJC, Christians against Christian nationalism. Faithful Christians from across the theological spectrum who were really concerned not only about what this was doing to our neighbors and the message this was sending to people who aren't just Christian, but a certain kind of Christian, about whether they belonged in the country or not, but what this was doing to the faith that was really animating that. And it's interesting, you both mentioned the flag, the American flag in the sanctuary. That does, the story you told, Kristin, I've heard a version of that from many other people. And just this week on BJC's social media, we reposted one of our top downloaded articles from our website. Does the American flag belong in the sanctuary? So this is that my predecessor Brent Walker wrote. So this is an issue and a question that endures for a lot of places. When we organized this talk tonight, we talked about white Christian nationalism. And so I wanted to get here to the piece of how racism interacts with Christian nationalism. In our Christians Against Christian Nationalism project, we state it this way: Christian nationalism often overlaps with and provides cover for white supremacy and racial subjugation. And so I would just ask you both, if you agree with that statement or how you might rephrase it. And also from your research and your study, what examples might you give to point to the phenomenon of white Christian nationalism?
Well, I'll jump in first on this one. I do try to be careful to use the term, the adjective white in front of Christian nationalism, because that really is what we're talking about if we're talking about the threats that we're currently seeing to American democracy. And we're about to come on to the 4th of July, thinking about the Declaration of Independence and those lofty ideals of equality that we see in the Declaration of Independence. But I do think that to this point, there is a competing tradition that's actually stronger and older, or not stronger necessarily today, but in it's competing today. I would say almost in equal terms. Sometimes it's winning, but it's older than that tradition, and it comes from this thing that I'm ashamed to say I knew virtually nothing about until like the last 5 years, and that is the doctrine of discovery. I went through an entire PhD program, seminary, I don't know how many Sunday school classes, without ever hearing anything in those settings about this doctrine. And just lay it out real quickly because I think it's so on point here. And it really is this idea. It was kind of came from a set of, believe it or not, 15th century papal bulls. And the key one for the American context is 1493. Right, and it was specifically a papal edict put out to justify Columbus's voyage and Spain's ownership of the lands that Columbus had touched on that voyage in 1492. And it basically says this: it says, that if any Europeans come across and quote unquote discover any lands inhabited by non-Christian peoples, that they are divinely justified in seizing those lands and dominating those people in the name of European civilization and Christianity. And it's a remarkable doctrine because it was so central all the way up through. It's the thing that justifies the African slave trade. It's the thing that justifies the whole colonial impulse there. And it actually gets incorporated into US law in the 19th century. And it is just a stunning thing in it because it basically just says there's two things: that European civilization is superior to all others, and that Christianity is the superior religion to all others. And if those two things are true, then whatever atrocities are committed in the process of people bringing European civilization and Christianity pale in comparison to the benefits that they are bringing, because they're bringing this superior civilization and religion. And that assumption, I think, it still animates, even though people wouldn't voice that out loud, I think necessarily in those terms, but this sense of innocence around white European domination of indigenous people, enslavement of African Americans, and a wanting to tell a story of innocence about America, I think is still animated by that impulse, right? But what's notable about it is that sense of the innocence of American quote unquote settlers, right, only makes sense if you believe those first two things: that European culture and civilization were superior and Christianity was superior. And so all those bad things that happened were just justified by the uplift that Europeans were giving everybody else. But if you no longer believe those things, then the innocence thing should fall by the wayside too, but we haven't quite gotten there. I think so. I've been thinking a lot about that piece of things and how this kind of defensiveness around things like critical race theory, and Kristin, you're mentioning the 1619 project, and just reasserting the 1776 project, right on top of it. That's all a kind of defensive reaction, I think, about reckoning with a more honest, story about who we are, and reckoning with those assumptions, right? Those assertions of white Christian supremacy, right? I think we still have not really dealt with that. When people said that and they got incorporated into U.S. law, they meant it. It wasn't just flourish. I mean, it was a real philosophical, theological assertion backed by the authority of God.
Yeah, I want to just add to that the significance of American innocence, right? Or this white Christian innocence, just this common motif that really does underlie this commitment to Christian America, the myth of America as a Christian nation, right? And one of the things that the authors of this now classic book, Search for Christian America, point out is, okay, well, what does it mean to be a Christian nation? We can say, well, actually, there were a number of deists among the founding fathers, but there were some professing Christians, but really, is it the profession of faith that makes for a Christian nation, or is it living according to maybe biblical values? And well, let's look at the situation with Native Americans, and let's look at the situation with African Americans, with enslaved peoples, and how much non-Christian behavior does it take until the country is no longer a Christian nation? I mean, that's the critics, but this myth of a Christian nation absolutely works on this assumption that America is God's chosen chosen nation. And therefore, what America does, meaning the, kind of the dominant powers, is de facto, right, God's will, and is righteous and is justified. And that can go on to really to justify all sorts of actions, even atrocities, imperial power, because if God is on our side, right, who can be against us? And, all the way through to the present. I was struck too in terms of my research for Jesus and John Wayne, and this rhetoric about America being a Christian nation, and that became just so important to kind of reassert post 1960s. And so this idea of we needed to recover a lost past. We needed to make America great again, right? That rhetoric is not new in 2016, that you hear that over and over again, from the 60s on. And it's the 60s really when things are pointed to, is that's when things kind of went off the rails. But if you just think about that timeline, all right, the idea that America was a Christian nation and everything was great up until the 1960s, that only makes sense if you are a white American, right? That makes absolutely no sense if you are a person of color, particularly if you're an African American, right? Not at all. And so, but that's an unexamined kind of whiteness there, because when white Christians are celebrating this myth of a Christian nation, and that when they are lamenting the loss and seeking to recover American greatness, they are not speaking explicitly in racialized terms, right? And yet, deeply embedded within those values are racialized values of white supremacy. And so it can be very difficult to have these conversations because you can very quickly just be talking past each other. But that's one thing that history can do for us, is show us what is actually embedded within these conversations and within these value systems.
Yeah, and I think when you talk about, I was just thinking about the conflation, again, of these identities and how circular this can get. So, if you believe in the providential founding of the United States, and that carrying out of God's will continues to the present day, then any questioning of America's past becomes a questioning of God,
Yes.
right? That many people would view as a big theological no-no, right? But there's a way of kind of giving credibility to your past actions by saying, well, this is all ordained by God in some way, and to question it is not. And it's the same in some ways, the same use of Christian nationalism, for instance, at the January 6th insurrection, again, giving credibility or using God as a mascot to justify indefensible action against the country itself. And so all of this, we just have racism just right underneath the surface, in all of this, and using it as an example of that. Talking about nations being blessed by God, I just 10 days ago, Representative Lauren Boebert, who represents Colorado's 3rd District, tweeted from her campaign account, "There have been 2 nations created for God's glory, Israel and the United States of America. We will glorify God." And so, I read this tweet, then I, saw the salute to the military last Sunday, and it just raised, and I'm reading your book, Kristin, and it raised for me, the role that violence and military force and foreign policy plays into this Christian nationalism ideology. And can you speak to that and what your research and study has shown?
Sure. Yeah. Well, in Jesus and John Wayne, I really focus in on the early Cold War era as a moment where we see this Christian nationalism come together with kind of gender traditionalism, and also American militarism. And you can see expressions of that earlier in American history in different ways, but you can also see a lot of disruptions during different periods of US history. So in the First World War, for example, you definitely had some Christian nationalism, but you had a lot of conservative Protestants who resisted Christian nationalism. You had conservative Protestants who were pacifists, and you had liberal Protestants who were gung-ho military, right? You didn't have this kind of the patterns that we see emerge so clearly in the Cold War era. And in the 1940s and the late 40s, this is when we see these pieces start to come together. And we see this tight connection between anti-communism and Americans of all stripes embrace this, right? And this is an important point here. Conservative evangelicals might hold to some of these values a little bit more deeply, more devotedly, but they're not out of step with many other Americans during this Cold War consensus era. And so they see communism as a very real threat because it is anti-God, anti-family, and anti-American. And so it is a real and present danger. It is a military threat. And so the defense against it needs to be a strong military defense as well. And it entails a strong faith, right? We need to keep America Christian, and conservative white evangelicals thought they were the best ones to preserve true Christianity. They needed to keep America safe. And so we needed strong men to fulfill that God-given role of protector, to protect faith, family, and nation. And then we needed a strong military defense. Now, what happened again, things were fine for a bit until the 1960s. And that's when we see all of these values start to kind of come into question with the rise of the feminist movement. We also have the civil rights movement that is disrupting kind of the status quo as well. But you have the Vietnam War and the anti-war movement. And through my research, I came to see that this Vietnam context is absolutely critical to the emergence of a kind of Christian nationalism on steroids, and to this oppositional identity, right? Where conservative white Protestants and conservative white Americans are holding to these set of values. So gender traditionalism and American militarism, and often white supremacy as well, over against other Americans. And when I looked back, I could see how this Christian nationalist like pageantry really blossomed during the Vietnam War era. And it was intentionally positioned over against the hippies, the anti-war protesters, right, the liberals. And so it became a sign of this cultural identity, and it was enmeshed with kind of faithful Christianity. And so, Explo 72 is a great example of this, where you have, tens of thousands of young evangelicals coming together, and I think it's the Texas Cotton Bowl, and they are, it's kind of in your face. The hippies are out there on the streets, they're protesting the war, and they had American flags, and they had US military members parading through, and they were cheering for, right? And this was like the young people, they were the counter culture. And same thing in 1970, Honor America Day. This is where we have Billy Graham orchestrating this on behalf of Richard Nixon. And this patriotism as a symbol of, who are the true patriots, and what does it mean to be a true patriot? It's to support the Republican Party and to support the Vietnam War. And then we get to 1976, the bicentennial, and that's when there's so much pageantry. And this is right as the religious right is kind of emerging as these new partisan alignments are taking shape. And so it's really kind of baked into the political identity of the religious right of conservative evangelicals over the last half century or so. And so we continue to kind of live in that moment. But you can kind of see historically just how important the Vietnam War was, and how oppositional they understood their support for U.S. militarism and at that time. And also, right, this idea too of American innocence, very important to preserve. Billy Graham was one of the kind of proponents of defending not just U.S. Military and U.S. foreign policy in Vietnam, but also defending the actions of U.S. service members, even in the face of stories of the atrocities that American soldiers were committing. And he really worked to defend the military, received the military's highest civilian award as thanks for doing so. And he wasn't alone. Like over time, James Dobson is another important figure in conservative white evangelicalism who really helped to bolster this the image of the U.S. military and really elevate it, that they were above and beyond reproach.
Yeah. Well, and that's such helpful context, and again, how history informs where we are right now. Hand in hand, in some ways, or maybe a close cousin to militarism can be authoritarianism. And so this is the last question that I have, and then we've had a number of wonderful questions come from those who are here tonight. So I'm going to turn to those in just a moment. But Robbie, you were quoted this week in a piece by Washington Post opinion columnist Jennifer Rubin about a recent poll by Morning Consult. And according to that poll, a scale measuring propensity toward right-wing authoritarian tendencies found right-leaning Americans scored higher than their counterparts in Australia, Canada, and the United Kingdom. 26% of the United States population, that's 1 in 4 Americans, qualified as highly right-wing authoritarian, twice the share of the number 2 countries, Canada and Australia. And so what, Robbie, do you make of this startling statistic?
I mean, well, in the piece, I spoke with Jennifer Rubin. I just pointed out, that one of the biggest differences between those countries, are Australia, Canada, the UK, and the US, is religion, right? And the way that religion operates, and particularly the dominance and influence of white evangelicals and other conservative white Christians on the Republican side of politics. And there is just this theological proclivity toward authoritarianism. And I think one thing that's become clearer to me, also in my research, is how this evangelical worldview is sort of dragging into the 21st century a 19th century hierarchical worldview of these kind of hierarchies. I mean, it kind of really does tie back to this doctrine of discovery doctrine. It's very much linked to that. But this idea that there are these divinely set up hierarchies. It's Christian over non-Christian, it's Protestant over Catholic, it's white over non-white, it's men over women. And in its strongest forms, I mean, this is a fundamentally anti-democratic and theocratic worldview. And it's just quite striking, right? That it's set up, to kind of build identity through kind of aggression toward others and outgroups. And I think it also is marked by this real aversion to critical thought or dissent, right, from its dominant story, and that you get ruled kind of being against God, right? If you kind of cross wires with that story. One thing I was going to add to what Kristin was saying, which Kristin, that was like a masterful. I'm glad we recorded this. That was like a masterful sweep of kind of how we got here. And the only one point I was going to add is a partisanship layer, that in that same period that you're describing, right, from 1960s to 1980, the kind of really critical period, is also when white conservative Christians, and particularly white evangelicals in the South, moved from being Democrats to Republicans, right? Because prior to 1960, all the white evangelicals in the South were all Democrats, right? And what ended up happening is, we're still kind of sorting through the confusion, I think, in some ways, in our public discourse, where the Democrats are getting accused of being the party of slavery, which is true, right? And Lincoln was a Republican, and that is true. But what's not often talked about is that those parties switched roles after the Civil Rights Act, right? And this is really the only explanation when you look at it. I mean, you can really see, there's a great book called The Rise of Southern Republicanism. These two political scientists, Merle and Earl Black, who are actually brothers. But it's just a masterful documentation of this migration. And the propulsion for that migration is the passage of the Civil Rights Acts in the mid-1960s. And you can really see by Reagan, there's a complete sea change where white evangelicals moved from being Democrats to Republicans. And when Reagan goes on the stump, right, and is campaigning in 1980, where does he go? He goes to Philadelphia, Mississippi, right, where civil rights workers were killed. And he gives a speech on what? States' rights, right? This kind of dog whistle kind of, signal to them that, yep, this is the party you should be in. And so I think that's just so striking. But there, and I think the only other thing I would say on the violence piece is too, that we just did a poll at PRI a few weeks ago. We found that about 15% of Americans believe that that true patriots may need to rise up violently in the country, and that number rises to a quarter of white evangelical Protestants, right? So it's a minority of that group, but it's a sizable minority of that group that has really gotten to the point of defending sort of their version of America. And I think the other thing that's been helpful to me is that I think is important is when you hear, when we hear people making claims about our country, is to take enough time to interrogate that little "our" word, right? And to okay, what does that mean? What does our country mean in this context? And to really unpack it, right? And many times when white Christians are talking about defending our country, taking back our country, right? It's very clearly a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant country that they're really talking about. And I think it's really worth us kind of pushing that forward, that they're not talking about an African-American Christian country that they're trying to bring back, right? If anything, they're trying to push that further back. And that's why, the one last stat here is one of the more striking and most predictive questions we asked in the 2016 election between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton was whether people saw the 1950s or whether they saw American way of life as being better or worse since the 1950s. And the two political parties are mirror images of each other on this question. About 2/3 of Republicans think it's changed for the worse since the 1950s. 2/3 of Democrats say it's changed for the better. There is no group in the country, and all white Christians are on the side of things it's changing worse, white mainline Protestants and white Catholics included. But if you look at white evangelicals in 2016, it was 3/4 of that group who said things have changed for the worst since the 1950s. So when we're thinking about the 4th of July and what country we're celebrating, we got to honestly ask, are we really celebrating this 1950s version of America? Are we celebrating 1860 version of America? Like which America are we really celebrating here? I think that's a really healthy question for us to be able to ask.
I could just add one more thing too, that we're talking a lot in terms of white and black here. But I mean, just today, Religion News Service published a piece on Lucas Kwong and his work on to draw attention to anti-Asian hate, which he links also to Christian nationalism. And, this question of what do we mean by our country, and what does it mean? What is the ideal that we're holding up? This kind of myth, and what does that look like? And that, how does race play into that? Not just the white-black divide, but across, kind of more diverse Americans as well. And we could look at, changing immigration policy and, from, 1965 on as well, and, kind of broaden this conversation as well.
Yeah, the Chinese Exclusion Act, right, in the 1920s. Yeah.
Absolutely. Really important reminder. So at this point, I am going to start turning to some of the questions that have been submitted, which are really excellent. And just a reminder, please keep them coming in the Q&A box if you have a question that you'd like me to ask the panelists. I'll get to as many as we can with the time that we have remaining. I think I'm going to combine a couple of these, kind of on the point of bringing in politics to all of this. There were a couple of questions about this. I mean, one is, do you all think that the rise of Christian nationalism is motivated or unconscious? Are Christian nationalists enlisting divine authority to push their political agendas? Or is the whole thing less Machiavellian and more organic? And then a related question from each of your perspectives: do you think that there is any chance that American evangelicalism can divorce faith from politics and political allegiance? What would this entail? Would this constitute a new kind of reformation?
Ooh, I mean, I have more to say on the second part. So I don't know, Robbie, do
Sure,
you have more
take
to say
that.
on the first
Mhm.
All
part?
right,
Or
I'll take the other one. Sure.
okay,
Yep.
okay. Why don't you start off then the Machiavellian question first, then I'll talk about if there's any.
I was counting on having the time to think about
Oh,
that.
okay,
while you
great.
were
I'll
reading.
talk about the second
No,
part then. I'll
that's right.
start. No, I'm good. So this question of, can American evangelicalism divorce from these political allegiances? We have to ask, what are we talking about? American evangelicalism? Are we talking about individual people who identify as an evangelical? Absolutely, right. There are many who, I mean, not the majority, but there are many who are not caught up in a kind of Christian nationalist or politicized faith. And there are many people right now who are questioning the ways in which they have been caught up in this, and many who are stepping back from it. At the same time, when we look at evangelicalism as a movement, as a series of networks, alliances, and institutions, that's where it's a lot harder to see any dramatic change on the horizon. I'm watching very closely. I'm looking for it, and I'm just not seeing it. It's just the way that the power dynamics work here. The importance of donors and powerful constituents in institutions and organizations that do hold a lot of sway. So it's kind of, we could go back to the church, or the flag in the front of the sanctuary kind of metaphor of, just try to move it and see what kind of pushback you're going to get, and see, is it worth it? Is it worth you losing your pulpit for this? Is it worth you losing, income, insurance, providing for your family? That's actually the decision that many people are facing right now in evangelical organizations and institutions who try to push back against this politicized version of evangelicalism. There are enough people and enough powerful people in those spaces who are keeping that from happening. And so what we see is individuals end up, trying, failing, and then exiting, and the institutions remain largely unchanged or even become more radicalized. So individually, yes, it's possible to disentangle this. Writ large, I think it's much more difficult, and something like that would rise to the level of a kind of reformation within, not within world Christianity. It's important to keep white evangelicalism or conservative white Christianity in its place, right? This is not the church. It is one subsection of the American church. But it would constitute a pretty dramatic, I think, reformation. I'm not expecting that to unfold any day now, but I'm a historian. I can talk about the past. Who knows about the future?
Great. Yeah. Well, thanks for buying me some time. And for a great answer. I do think it's right to segue from that to this other question. I do feel like many pastors are facing the same kind of pressures that pastors were facing in the 1960s on civil rights issues, right? Am I willing to lose my pulpit, right, to speak up on this issue, right? And that was, in fact, the cost for many. In fact, more often than not, that's what happened, right? When people did speak out, they lost their church. It was very rare that someone would speak out and keep it. On the question of whether this movement is Machiavellian or organic, I'm going to do the classic academic thing and say both. But let me explain. I'm not going to cop out. I'm going to explain what I mean by that. So I think there's no doubt, and there is no doubt that the beginnings of the kind of white Christian supremacy in the country, that doctrine of discovery that landed on the shores of the U.S., right, or landed on the shores of the Americas from the beginning, well before the nation. That is in the DNA of the Christianity that lands on the shores of the Americas, right? So it comes with people coming from Europe. There is this sense of manifest destiny. There is this sense of being the superior peoples, right? And that other people are to be subjected to. So I think that's a kind of demon to be exorcised, I think, from modern day American Christianity that comes deep, from our past. And, it's really clear that when the church was aligning, that, for example, we say, if I just say churches and civil rights, what comes to mind? Most people think, oh, Black churches, right? They were organizing hubs for the civil rights movement. But what few people really think about are the white churches that were organizing the massive resistance to the civil rights movement. And that just went, again, they got a pass, it kind of went under the radar screen. And I think that coming to light shows this was absolutely a coordinated, deliberate campaign to support white supremacy with Christianity. That's really what most of my book is about, is telling that story, right? It wasn't just that white Christians were sitting idly by on the sidelines while all this was happening. I mean, white Christianity was the central tent pole, is the way I described it, holding up the project of white supremacy in the country. Now, one of the things that, to get to the second part, one of the things that happens, right, if a movement is really successful, it actually renders itself kind of part of the furniture, right? It renders itself invisible, right? And I think that one of the challenges I've had, this kind of part of my own journey, born into and growing up in that world, it was very, very hard for me to see white supremacy, very hard, right? It was rendered invisible. It was part of the furniture. It was part of the air that I breathed. It was part of the theology that I got taught. And so if there's things like the American flag, I think the kind of other component to that is the white Jesus and the stained glass, right? Is the other kind of representation of this. And so if you want to get a fight about removing the flag, wait till you try to remove the white Jesus out of the stained glass, in the sanctuary, if you really want to fight. But I titled the first chapter of my book "Seeing," SEEING, because I feel like, for me, and I think for many white Christians, the hardest thing is to kind of getting on this pathway is just seeing the problem, and I think that goes to its great success, that it just did kind of build it into a very coherent world where seeing, and just one quick example for me, like, I grew up in Mississippi, drug its feet integrating our public schools until the 1970s. So I was in elementary school, that dates me, but I was in elementary school in the 1970s. When the first Black kids showed up at our public school, and our church had nothing to say about that. It was to pretend as if nothing was going on. Even the newspapers were writing about it. Obviously we're experiencing it in real time, this real kind of changes in our school, and the church had just utter silence on that. And I think that means that it has both been a deliberate and kind of Machiavellian thing that has been about power. It's about preserving white power, white Christian power in the country and privilege in the country. And once it achieves a certain level of that, it can just be kind of organic and kind of part of the air that we breathe and still be doing its work.
Yeah. I would absolutely agree. It's this both and situation. And for me, as I researched evangelical popular culture, and in Christian publishing, even in Christian music, recording artists, Christian radio, and Christian school textbooks, homeschool curriculum, right? These values are just so deeply embedded. And so they're being delivered, they're being received, they're being inculcated, and they're being passed on from generation to generation. And so it is a kind of top down, but it's also very much a kind of, then it becomes, as Robbie says, this organic and largely unexamined, very much taken for granted value system that is very difficult for those who have embraced it to separate out Christian faith from these values, because in fact, it's inseparable, certainly the way they've experienced them.
Yeah. Well, I think you've both done a great job of laying out, the problems that we have here, and we do have a solution-oriented question, and I know that you both have done so much speaking in Christian audience, to all kinds of audiences, but in a lot of Christian audiences. So here's a question from someone who's here with us. He says, as a Black Christian millennial, I'm becoming somewhat of an anomaly. I've read both of your books and loved them, but I feel like you're preaching to the choir in my case. So my question is, how do we speak to the Lauren Boeberts of the world? How can we get your material in their hands? I think it's a great question. It's a question that I get sometimes from about Christians against Christian nationalism,
Yeah.
and I think I'll just kind of lead off, and then I would love to hear, but I think that Christian nationalism is in so many of these different communities that we are speaking to, and so when you go into church communities, you're going to have a spectrum of people, on this belief, and so we are reaching them, I think, and especially and often the best messenger is not the New York Times bestselling author who comes to speak to them, but the person who sits down the pew from them.
Yes.
So maybe if we're
Yes.
reaching somebody in the congregation who can then talk to someone else and building on the relationship, that's the way. Now, that doesn't get to Representative Boebert, but maybe her constituents can. And I would point to the Christians Against Christian Nationalism resource, which is an open source of now more than 23,000 people who self-identify as a Christian, that you can go by state, by city, by community. And we can even give by congressional district, to tell people these are the Christians Against Christian Nationalism in your district.
Yeah, well, I don't know about getting in front of Lauren Boebert, or we could add Marjorie Taylor Greene to that. But just this week, Ted Cruz did encounter some of my writing and wasn't particularly thrilled with it. But you never know where our work ends up. I would say that I think Robbie's had this experience as well with his book, that precisely what you're describing is happening. That we're ambassadors to a certain extent, but really it's family, it's friends, it's pastors, it's parishioners who are coming across our books and who are seeing in them, their own experiences very much so. I mean, just on Twitter today, one woman tweeted about having her mom read Jesus and John Wayne, and how her mom, just said, "This is my life. This is my life," and she can now see and is at a place. I think the last 4.5 years politically have brought many evangelicals to a place of at least saying, what is going on here? Sensing that there might be some conflict, some tension between the values that they profess, their religious values and the current kind of political situation. There are certainly tensions, within families of, children saying, this is not my Christianity. Sometimes it's the other way around. And so these conversations are happening. And I think both of our books have the power to open up those conversations in new ways, because they bring history, because they bring stories that people can connect to, that people can place their own experiences into these narratives, and then have a way to make sense of them. Like, so many times I hear from readers, this is a story of my life, but I never understood how all these pieces fit together, right? And it's that understanding, this is what I participated in. For some, this is what I was complicit in. And the moment does seem right right now to have these conversations. And there are many books that are facilitating this, not just our two. I think of Jamar Tisby's book from a couple of years ago that was, for many, kind of the first book for a lot of white evangelicals to help them say, I wasn't getting the whole story here, right? There's something missing here. There's Anthea Butler's recent book, White Evangelical Racism. There are many other books right now that are being received. And then what happens is somebody says in a church, saying, hey, let's do this for our adult Sunday school. Let's do this for our church book club. Let's do this. Let's read this together, mother and daughter. And I think that's what's happening. So it's not just preaching to the choir. I have to say, I've been surprised in the last 12 months how many individual proselytizers there are inside these spaces, and many who are risking relationships, some who are even risking jobs to bring this work to the attention of their communities.
I'll just tag on a little bit. I think it's well said. That has been my experience too. I'm actually more hopeful today than I was when I turned in the manuscript to the book. So I turned the manuscript of the book at the end of 2019, and that was before 2020 and all of the events of 2020. And I've just been stunned at the number of people who not, and I'm not talking like, the big, like a big church in New York, but like, a church in Mississippi and Alabama and Texas and Louisiana, trying to have these conversations in communities where it's not going to be easy to have it. And some of them courageously, in kind of a white church that says, we're going to have this conversation and we want our African-American church brothers and sisters down the street from us to kind of be connected in this conversation, and trying to bridge those gaps in many ways. So yeah, I hope and think and believe it's not just preaching to the choir. And I think one of the things that I know is true about Kristin's book, and I know I was thinking about it in my book, is that in many ways, we're telling our own stories here of our own kind of journey on these issues, and of our own piecing of this together. I mean, I certainly can say that that in many ways that White Too Long was my attempt to wrestle with my own faith in the light of what I was seeing about it in its support of white supremacy, and just trying to pull those threads apart, try to figure out what was left, at the end of that process, and what I could say about it. And that was as much for me as for any public audience. But I think it's that quality about it that invites people in, I think, to have a conversation, maybe in a less defensive way. I think we're not an outsider wagging our finger at stupid white Christians, I mean, it's much more, we'd be pointing our finger at ourselves in many ways. So I think that it's that piece of it. And the other thing I would say is that I am seeing more and more white Christian churches trying to build community outside of white Christianity. And that I think, kind of going back to this theme of, mirror that we were talking about earlier about the two holidays. I mean, I do think that in many ways, there's all this work that has to be done inside of white Christian churches for themselves. I think there's some work though that can only get done well when they put themselves in community with other non-white Christians. And it's those relationships in that community, I think, where a kind of another level of work tends to happen. I write about two churches in Macon, Georgia, that are on this journey together, two Baptist churches there. And as I kind of observed them and kind of watched their journey, it became really clear, particularly for the white church, that there were just places they would never be able to go on their own. It was only in being in relationship and in being kind of accountable to that relationship that kind of pulled them into new space.
Well, and I would say, when you were talking about how your book, Robbie, is part social science, part history, part memoir, the memoir part of really both of your experiences, I think, really does help the reader draw themselves into that experience as well. So, it's not just the audience, but even just, I can personally say, reading it, hearing about your experiences, you resonate with them. You're like, oh yeah, that's like mine, or it reminds you of another experience. And I think that's so much part of it. And that's wonderful that you're having that experience in such diverse communities. You were speaking about the churches in Macon, which really relates to one of the questions here. Do you know of good examples of churches or communities successfully countering white Christian superiority in ways that don't quickly add to polarity? So I wanted to raise that and see if there were other examples that either of you had to give some people on our conversation here tonight some hope and some examples of how to move forward.
Yeah. And so in my own, I'm going to mostly just pitch this one to Robbie, because in my own experience, personally, I was a part of a multiracial, bilingual church that died. Right. We tried 10 years. 10 years I was there. I think the church was in existence for about 12. And ended up not being able to really rise above some of these deep-seated differences. And, the intentions were great. And then really kind of working things out. Well, but I still need my, Sunday school on a Sunday morning for my white kids, because that's what churches do. And, things like that, where you just, we ended up falling apart. And I think that's when you look at studies of multiracial church experiments, it's not all that heartening, really. And so, looking to different models of this, partnerships of different kinds of relationships. And I think that's where, Robbie does have this wonderful story in White Too Long about at least one model of what that might look like.
Yeah, I'll just say a little more to flesh it out. In the case of Macon, it was actually two churches that shared a history. They were both actually still called First Baptist Church. Macon's not that big, and these churches were literally like you can see one steeple from the other. You could throw a golf ball from one parking lot to the other, and yet they had existed in this configuration for 100 years without really acknowledging each other's presence. And in fact, they started as the same church in 1820. And the situation there was that white slave owners were taking enslaved people to church with them, right? And the whites would sit in the front and enslaved Africans would sit in the back. And that was the setup for the first 40 years of the church. And they split around the Civil War. African-American church eventually got its own kind of building and independence. And it wasn't until 7 years ago that they actually made any, kind of effort at acknowledging that history and reconnecting with one another. It really just took. You're speaking of the word organic. There was no blueprint for it. There's no like magic 10-step program. They just basically said, we need to be in community with each other. We need to know each other. We don't know what that means. We don't know how we're going to do it, but we're going to try to make that happen. And they began with like an Easter egg roll for the kids on Sunday morning at a park that was nearby, both of them, right? Kind of neutral ground for the kids, something safe. They kind of moved to potluck dinners, no agenda, just kind of getting people to know each other. And so it was built less around worship and pulpit swaps and that kind of thing than it was about food and just kind of everyday rituals of kind of getting to know one another, but it's built into quite a robust thing. They eventually did formalize it into kind of a covenant, had a joint worship service to kind of recognize this commitment they were making to almost a marriage ceremony, really, a kind of covenanted relationship that they were entering into with one another. Had communion together, and even there, Kristin, to your point, they were telling me stories about how they had to navigate the different ways that they did communion, right? That one only had male deacons, the other one had female deacons, and they had to kind of sort that out. One of them did it very formally with like white gloves and this very formal way, and the other one was kind of passing plastic little juice cups around the congregation. So even in the kind of those kind of cultural things, they kind of had to work out. And it's still true. Martin Luther King, had this kind of statement about Sunday morning at 11 a.m. being the most segregated hour in America. It is still largely true. The number of multiracial churches, even if you set the bar at only 20% of kind of the non-dominant race, and that counts as a multiracial church if it's kind of more than 20% non-dominant race, it's only about 15% of America's churches that are in that category, right? So we're still talking about 85% of America's churches are essentially monoracial churches. So I think as a practical matter, we're going to have to solve some of this by cooperation between congregations. And maybe that lends itself to kind of merge stuff later on. But the two churches in Macon, I think, have no intention of merging the congregations. They want to kind of maintain their distinct identities, but they want to be walking in community together. And I think that's the new thing that's really made a difference. And it's actually part of a little bit broader movement called the New Baptist Covenant movement. That's part of a group actually Jimmy Carter helped start to help Baptist churches, white and black, kind of bridge those gaps and deal with this shared history. But there's not a lot of that, and there's not a lot of blueprint. So I think we're still kind of feeling our way along here. It's pretty new territory.
So I think I'm going to close it with a pair of questions here that kind of pose a challenge, I think, in some ways, Robbie, to the vision that you gave us at the beginning of seeing our two holidays as a mirror, and also a question that kind of a personal reflection to help us see a way forward. So the challenge is, does the conflation of Christianity and American identity and white evangelicalism make it impossible or far more difficult to see the two federal holidays as mirrors, as an opportunity to think about how American values have been experienced differently? So in other words, does this white Christian nationalism, how is it a barrier, to seeing them as mirrors? And then the more personal question is, how do you personally manage to break yourself out of that conflation of God and country mindset? We all spoke to the fact that we were raised in the same kind of milieu of God and country together. And so, I think some of that might provide a way out for the question about white Christian nationalism as a barrier to seeing the holidays together.
Well, I'll first say that, although I was raised in a conservative white Christian community, mine wasn't this kind of Christian nationalist, kind of American patriotism at the time. I think that community has shifted a little bit in recent decades. But I grew up in a Dutch ethnic community. My mom was an immigrant from the Netherlands. I went to a Christian university where my most formative professors were not American. So they were Canadian and Dutch. And so I think that there may be a lesson there too, in terms of, being in community and encountering ideas and encountering Christians, right, who do not fit necessarily in these boxes. Or so think in terms of global Christianity is important. I know a lot of white evangelicals will talk about the global church, but it's not just being aware of the global church. It's also on what terms and what are the power dynamics there. And in fact, what we see is this kind of white Christian nationalism is being exported through different networks into the global church. And it's not American nationalism, but it takes root in places like Hungary, in places like Brazil, in places like Kenya in various forms, and even in Canada and in the UK. And there are stories there. And so it's not just global connections that are going to solve this. And we also have to look at power dynamics and ideologies at play. But I think that personally, opening ourselves up to being aware of the walls that we've built, or the walls that have been built around us, and they're often we're talking about racial boundaries, maybe we're talking about denominational boundaries, and then trying to cross those lines, cross those boundaries, have real relationships, and a willingness to listen, a willingness to learn. Right, you're not going out there as a kind of as a savior, as a missionary, as a proselytizer, crossing those lines. It really is to be in community with others, and when you are in genuine community, I think that some of your preconceived notions will be challenged. And so looking back, I'm really quite grateful that some of those really formative influences on my life, particularly when I was an undergraduate, were not American. And not just that, but they had in their own history, the history of the Dutch in the Second World War, and they had a certain skepticism towards nationalism and towards militarism, and they were bringing that set of experiences into this country. Right now, I attend a church that has a basic English service, and so we have members from all over the world, refugees and immigrants, and people who are coming to our church to be in community with people from all over the world. And that does change things. And so I think that we could be much more intentional individually about seeking out spaces, because our country and our churches, our religious organizations are not set up, right? They're set up to keep us from community with people who are different from us. And so it actually does take some real active work in terms of where you live, in terms of where you work, where your kids go to school, and where you worship, in order to be in community with people who are different.
Yeah, I'll just add a little bit to that. I mean, it's going to be it's because I think, I kind of live in kind of the academic world a little bit. I mean, not in the same way that Kristin does, but it's been both kind of personal relationships and the worlds that have been opened up to me through books, through reading. people with different perspectives, so like in my kind of professional and kind of friendship orbits, it's, being conversational, and many of these people have got books out now, like Aubrey Hendricks, Anthea Butler, Jamar Tisby, Eddie Glaude, who all have been writing in the last few years. And in many ways, I mean, if you want a mirror, if you're a white Christian, you want a mirror, pick up one of those books, right? That kind of give you a perspective from an African-American scholar or theologian. And then going back, it's also one of the things reason why I think it's such a great tragedy, for example, that the Southern Baptist Seminary presidents saw the need to pass this ordinance condemning critical race theory, whatever that means, or they think it means, as incompatible with Baptist faith and message, is that one of the key moments on my journey was at Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary when I was a student there. And I had a professor assign James Cone to me, right? And to read a really powerful, thoughtful, wicked smart, and biblically grounded encounter of what Jesus meant, right? Not from a white perspective. I mean, was stunning to me as someone who grew up in this very insular world, went to a Baptist college, right? And here I was at a Baptist seminary, straight out of Mississippi. And that was an eye-opening, and I would say, like, no kidding. I mean, it was a moment of like a key moment, like I think in like my faith journey, right? I mean, it was a real turning point for me, because it was about seeing something from a perspective that I just didn't have the ability to do on my own, right? And so from there it was Bell Hooks and Cornel West and Howard Thurman, and really diving into Toni Morrison and James Baldwin. I mean, James Baldwin has shaped my theology most recently more than anyone else I can think of, right? Deeply, deeply thoughtful and theological, in his insights. In fact, the epigraph of the book is, and the book's title, it comes from a quote from James Baldwin, where he's accusing Americans of being white too long, and I kind of translate that into Christian space and ask, have we Christians been white too long? And I think that, to me, that really has been this kind of first step, this kind of, not kidding, but the first step is admitting you have a problem, right? I think it was this kind of moment of, okay, there are things that I'm not seeing well, right? And biblically, theologically, we call that sin, right? It's an occluded, like very distorted vision that I think many of us have. And the way to clarity, I think, is to get out of the kind of parochial white world, right, that we're in, and find ways that this other light can really come through. I mean, it's really been a life-changing experience for me, and it has been through those other authors that have been willing to put their own different experiences out there and really challenge white Christians to see things from a different space.
Amen to that book list. And I'm just going to add Esau McCauley's Reading While Black,
Yeah.
and also a book that's going to be out this fall by Dante Stewart called Shoutin' in the Dark. And it is incredibly powerful and very much inspired by James Baldwin. So it's also available for pre-order.
Wonderful. Well, thank you both for this really wonderful conversation tonight. And I, highly recommend, I'm sure many of people on the call have already read Jesus and John Wayne and White Too Long, but reminder that the White Too Long paperback edition is coming out on July 13th. It has a new afterword reflecting on the 2020 election and the January 6th insurrection. So you can pre-order it today and it will ship on July 13th. Thank you, Robbie. Thank you, Kristin. Thank you, PRRI and BJC for co-hosting this event. And thank you most of all to all of you for joining us tonight and for your really wonderful questions. You have really enriched our conversation here tonight. We look forward to continuing it at a later time. So thank you and good night.